The moment the final judgment was read aloud inside the private study, the room seemed to lose its air instantly. King Charles did not shout, he did not make any sudden movements, and he did not look away. He simply stared down at the black ink on the official white paper, completely transfixed by the words that changed the balance of royal power in a single breath. Judges had formally ruled that Meghan had absolutely no claim to duchy assets. For a palace that has always been built on a foundation of silence, strategic whispers, and carefully managed appearances, this was a kind of decisive legal decision that spoke much louder than any glittering crown could ever manage. Charles lowered his eyes again, his breathing heavy and measured, as though reading the sentence a second time might somehow soften its heavy blow. It did not. The court summary lay before him with a brutal, unyielding calm, and the king understood at once that this was not only a massive legal defeat for Meghan, it was a deep family wound made permanent and official. Duchy assets, meaning the strictly protected lands, generational incomes, and historic holdings tied directly to official royal duty rather than ordinary private family ownership, had been placed completely beyond her reach by senior judges who left absolutely no room for emotional arguments or personal pleas. This mattered immensely because these specific assets carried far more than mere financial wealth. They carried institutional authority, historic rank, sovereign tradition, and that invisible, sacred line between being close to the crown and being able to command any part of it. Meghan heard the final decision through a formal, highly restricted phone call, and her face tightened instantly before she could even utter a single word to her legal team. She had certainly expected heavy institutional resistance, and she had expected cold, bureaucratic language from the London courts, but the specific phrase "no claim" landed with a finality that felt deeply personal. Prince Harry listened intently right beside her, his body incredibly tense and his lips sealed in complete silence, because he knew exactly what those words would mean inside the ancient palace walls. They would not be heard as mere legal language alone. They would be treated as an absolute boundary, a stern warning, and perhaps even a public correction of their ambitions. Meghan did not break down into tears. Instead, she became completely still, and that heavy stillness carried far more raw anger than any tears ever could. Charles set the paper down slowly onto his grand wooden desk. His hand remained resting on the edge of the official folder for several long moments, as if letting go of it completely would make the harsh reality even harder to deny. The king knew precisely why this ruling mattered so much for the future of the monarchy. Marriage into the royal family had officially not created a path to protected duchy holdings, and that single legal point threatened to completely reshape every past and future argument about status, inheritance, and personal influence. Palace aides standing nearby in the corridors understood it too. They exchanged very careful, hushed looks, not because they were surprised by the actual letter of the law, but because they deeply feared what this decision would do to fragile people behind it. The silence outside the room felt just as heavy as the tension within. Prince William waited patiently just beyond the heavy doors, already fully aware that the judgment had successfully done what private, painful family conversations never could. It had drawn a clear line in public. The prince did not rush into his father's study. He stood there outside, measured, composed, intense, knowing his father had just been forced to confront the immense cost of protecting the crown from within his own immediate family. But before William could even step through that door to comfort the king, the palace had to face the reality of the people whose lives were now tied to one brutal sentence. This was not simply a judgment about historic land, massive wealth, or complex legal language. It was a definitive judgment that struck directly at the heart of identity. For Charles, it was another painful wound in a reign already heavily burdened by deep family tension and public scrutiny. For William, it was a necessary warning to protect the future. For Harry, it was a profound humiliation on the global stage. And for Meghan, it instantly became the exact moment where her highest expectations collided violently with the immovable, ancient walls of the British monarchy. Charles stood at the absolute center of it all, not only as a ruling king, but as a deeply hurting father whose private family pain had now been dragged into the cold language of judges' courts and permanent files. He understood exactly why this ruling mattered so much. The monarchy could easily survive public arguments, long distances, and even intense public anger, but once family conflict entered official legal territory, every single word became dangerous. The royal estate structure, meaning the highly protected system of land, generational wealth, and authority held exclusively for royal duty rather than ordinary personal use, had officially become the ultimate battlefield. Charles knew that this was no longer about one simple family disagreement. It was about who could reach into the heart of the crown and who would be stopped permanently at the palace gate. Meghan had once entered royal life with a high expectation that official recognition would automatically bring lasting security, and that security would ultimately bring permanent relevance to her global platform. She had willingly carried the immense weight of relentless scrutiny, demanding ceremonies and harsh public judgment, believing there would be a material reward for her endurance. But now, the High Court had answered her ambitions with a cold, devastating legal distinction that shattered her worldview. Symbolic royal status did not, under any circumstances, automatically become a material claim to protected institutional wealth. That specific legal detail cut deeply into her spirit because it permanently separated public image from actual ownership, empty titles from tangible control, and mere closeness to the family from legal entitlement to the crown's golden gates. Meghan felt the full, crushing force of that separation inside her home, and Harry felt it with her just as intensely. He paced back and forth during a highly private phone call with their remaining allies in London, his frustration rising visibly with every careful, rehearsed sentence delivered from the other end of the line. He desperately wanted to defend his wife. He wanted to completely reject the court's decision, and he wanted to strike back at the institutional system. But the legal ruling left almost absolutely no room for appeal or logical argument. That total helplessness burned far worse than the defeat itself, because it stripped away their leverage. William, watching the situation unfold from his own office, remained completely controlled, but a deep, unyielding tension moved beneath every single word he chose during his meetings with palace advisors. The prince saw this court case as definitive proof of something he had feared for many years. If emotional claims and personal grievances were allowed to press against the ancient palace boundaries, those boundaries would eventually crack, weaken, and crumble under the pressure of modern demands. For him, this institutional stance was not an act of petty cruelty. It was an act of survival and absolute protection. The future king firmly believed that the crown had to survive at all costs, even when intense family pain and personal trauma demanded exceptions to the rule. That deep-rooted belief made him appear remarkably calm to the public, but it did not mean he was entirely untouched by the tragedy. He knew Harry would hear the court's ruling as a final, hateful rejection from his bloodline, and he knew Meghan would see it as a bitter confirmation that the palace walls had always been built much higher than what was promised to her when she wedded into the family. Camilla watched Charles closely during the long evenings that followed, sensing everything the king refused to say out loud to his closest aides. The queen consort noticed how the king intentionally avoided speaking Harry's name during official briefings, as if uttering it aloud would make the deep family wound bleed all over again. She understood better than anyone that this decision had completely reopened old, buried battles. It was duty against affection, institutional order against personal regret, and family love against royal survival. As everyone inside the palace walls slowly absorbed the initial shock of the verdict, the administration began looking backward into the past, searching for the exact moment when this legal storm first became completely unavoidable. Hidden beneath the complex language of the ruling was a private, unspoken moment from months earlier that everyone now recognized as the true point of no return. Every royal crisis has a specific moment people later pretend they did not see coming, and in this story, it was not a grand courtroom speech or a viral public interview. It was a private dinner held at Clarence's house where one single sentence about future family security made the silver cutlery stop moving instantly. From that fateful evening onward, the issue was no longer emotional. It was entirely legal, highly personal, and completely impossible to bury. Charles had entered that dinner determined to keep the evening calm, wanting warmth or at least a convincing appearance of it, because he knew how fragile the family relationships had become. Clarence's house, the historic London royal residence long associated with private family meetings, was supposed to offer a much softer setting than the cold palace machine, but all softness vanished when Meghan raised a specific question of future access to assets connected to duchy protection and royal family security. She did not speak like someone asking for a favor. She spoke like someone demanding an answer that had been delayed for too long. Meghan framed the entire matter as a basic question of fairness and equality, and Charles felt the entire room tighten around him. The king tried his best to keep his voice gentle and paternal, but his facial expression changed instantly because he understood the immense danger hidden within her choice of words. This was no longer a complaint about unfair media treatment or lack of emotional recognition. It was a direct challenge to tradition itself. The duchy, meaning the highly protected estate system tied strictly to royal duty and inherited authority, was never meant to become a bargaining table for private pain. Yet Meghan's sharp question forced everyone present to confront whether royal duty carried any lasting material promise beyond empty ceremony, titles, and public sacrifice. William answered her with a quiet, icy firmness that made the moment much sharper. The prince told the dinner table that personal grievances could not rewrite inherited structures, no matter how painful the grievance felt. Harry pushed back at once, hearing his brother's words not as a structural caution, but as a cold, personal rejection of his family's worth. Harry had spent years believing that Meghan's suffering should count for something more than mere palace sympathy, and now William was drawing a hard line between emotional cost and legal right. The future king did not raise his voice, but his absolute calmness only deepened the wound. Meghan placed her glass down slowly, looked directly at the future king, and asked whether royal duty meant anything at all if it offered no lasting material protection to those who sacrificed for it. That single sentence became the permanent trigger for the legal war that followed. Charles said absolutely nothing for a long moment, and the heavy silence that followed carried far more force than any shouting argument could manage. After that dinner, private notes were quickly made by advisors, and top legal experts were quietly consulted. What had begun as a tense family conversation over dinner began moving rapidly into a formal, cold institutional review where all emotion would be stripped away and every single claim measured against ancient structure, historical precedent, and legal power. Charles left that evening deeply shaken because he knew something had fundamentally changed forever. Meghan had not simply asked about security. Harry had not simply defended his wife. William had not simply protected tradition. Each of them had revealed the violent battle line beneath the family's polite language. What began as an uncomfortable sentence over dinner now moved rapidly toward a brutal, face-to-face confrontation where no one could hide behind protocol. The ultimate confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a chair being pulled back, a heavy wooden door closing firmly, and Meghan asking Charles directly whether the institution had decided her worth before the judges ever spoke a word. Charles looked much older in that exact moment, the weight of the crown pressing visibly upon his shoulders. Harry stood right beside her, looking deeply wounded and furious at the world. Across the room, William said almost nothing at first, and that cold silence made the air heavier than lead. Meghan had requested this emergency meeting because the court ruling had given her an answer, but it was not the answer she wanted from the family. She did not only want to know why judges had rejected her claim, she wanted to know why the palace had not stood behind her during the process. Charles understood the immense danger before she even finished speaking. A private royal meeting, meaning a closed family discussion without aides, advisors, or official witnesses guiding the words, could either calm the storm or make it completely impossible to control, and this specific one carried the full weight of judgment, pride, and years of accumulated injury. Charles tried to keep his voice steady, but Meghan pressed him directly, asking whether the institution had ever truly intended to protect her beyond public expectations. The king did not answer quickly, and that long pause cut through the room like a knife, signaling a division that no royal decree could ever heal. Harry turned his back toward William, and the intense anger he had held inside for months finally broke through the fragile surface. He openly accused the prince of treating the court's definitive decision like a personal victory, as though the judgment had neatly solved a structural problem instead of deepening a profound family fracture. William absorbed the sharp, stinging words without flinching a single inch, but the immense restraint cost him a great deal of emotional energy. He knew Harry wanted unconditional family loyalty. He knew Meghan wanted official institutional recognition. Yet the future king firmly believed the monarchy could not survive if every painful experience became a material claim against the crown's resources. His cold silence was not a sign of weakness. It was absolute control under immense pressure. William finally spoke, and the temperature in the room changed instantly. He said the court had simply done what the family had refused to do for years, which was to define the institutional boundary clearly. The sentence landed with shocking force because no one in the room could pretend anymore. A boundary in royal terms meant the unyielding line between a personal relationship and institutional authority, between being part of the family story and having actual power over protected assets. Harry looked utterly betrayed, Meghan looked deeply wounded, and Charles looked completely devastated because he knew the prince had just said aloud what the king had feared for months. Charles quietly admitted to them that he had sincerely hoped the matter would never reach the senior judges. He had wanted the family wound to remain private, even as it grew far too large to hide from the world. Now, private pain had officially become a piece of constitutional theater, and every single person in that room understood the permanent cost of the performance. Meghan left the room first, not defeated in her proud posture, but completely hardened by her disappointment. Harry followed her closely, carrying a raw anger that had absolutely nowhere safe to land. William remained behind with Charles, silent again because the ruling was not only about Meghan's specific claim. It revealed a world who truly controlled the golden gates to royal wealth. Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself with loud noises. It sits quietly in ledgers, official signatures, royal seals, and the quiet authority of institutional figures who never raise their voices. After the ruling, Charles understood something deeply painful. Even a ruling king cannot simply bend every single inherited structure to soothe a personal family wound. The duchy had its own legal guardians, its own ancient limits, and its own cold memory of every line ever crossed in history. Charles entered his final private briefing with the heavy burden of a father and the strict limits of a monarch pressing against his chest. He had already faced Meghan's sharp pain, Harry's explosive anger, and William's icy silence, but now he faced something much colder: the legal machinery of royal control. Duchy assets were simply not built to answer human emotion. They were guarded by legal structures, permanent trustees, and long-standing rules designed to keep personal disputes from ever weakening the crown. Senior advisors explained the legal consequences with very careful, measured voices, and Charles looked visibly torn between his worlds. Sympathy could not alter the ruling, and regret could not soften its permanent meaning. The king listened as they laid out the final truth. Meghan's claim failed completely because the assets had never been treated as divisible family property available through personal demand. They belonged strictly to a protected system, not to the shifting needs of wounded relationships. Charles gripped the edge of the table tightly, and one elderly courtier watching nearby understood the immense pain in that simple gesture. The monarch was permanently trapped between fatherly sorrow and sovereign duty, and neither side offered him any mercy. By the next morning, the ruling had escaped the palace walls completely and become a massive national obsession. It was no longer a private dispute hidden in legal files. Across Britain, one striking image captured the mood: a newspaper front page showing Charles in a dark suit beside the bold headline, "Duchy Door Closed." The monarchy had its legal verdict, and now the public had theirs. Broadcasters seized the ruling with relentless energy, framing it as the exact moment the monarchy made its hidden boundaries visible to the modern world. Meghan's name was spoken beside words like access, status, security, and rejection. Harry's silence became a major part of the story too, because silence in royal life never stays empty for long. William's position was read by the public as pure discipline. Charles's hesitation was read as deep sorrow, and every interpretation pushed the family deeper into a media storm they could no longer contain. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, treating the moment like a solemn turning point in modern history. People were no longer asking only what the court had decided. They were asking what the decision revealed about belonging, power, and the immense cost of entering a family that is also an ancient institution. In the end, the ruling did not crown a clear winner. It simply exposed a brutal truth. Meghan had lost her claim. Harry had lost another fight with the institution. Charles had lost the comfort of pretending family pain could remain private, and William had gained a heavy burden he never asked for. The monarchy survived a massive shock, but it did so by choosing cold structure over human sentiment. Charles closed the official file himself, and the sound of the folder closing carried far more grief than triumph. The palace had accepted the decision as the absolute end of the matter. The ruling separated emotional belonging from legal entitlement once and for all. It told the world that being close to the royal story did not mean holding power over the royal structure. Meghan was left with a sting of exclusion, and Harry was left facing a harder truth than anger alone could carry. He had stood beside her through public storms and the slow collapse of old family trust, but love could not rewrite inherited law. Public status could not unlock protected wealth, and personal pain could not bend the crown. Their suffering was real, but the court had turned that suffering into something the monarchy could withstand to ensure its continuity. William saw the victory and the immense cost at the same time, knowing that while the defenses were strengthened, reconciliation had been made permanent legal history. The crown had been protected from future claims that might blur private emotion with official control, but protection came with immense pain. William had helped guard the wall, and now he had to live with the heavy silence on the other side of it. Charles accepted the palace's final internal message with visible sadness. The boundary was settled. No private appeal, no quiet settlement, and no emotional intervention would ever soften the outcome. The king was stunned because the ruling did not merely reject a claim. It forced everyone involved to see exactly where the crown ends and where personal hope begins. The monarchy chose continuity over compromise, duty over emotional repair, and legal clarity over family ambiguity. With that final line drawn, the palace did not celebrate its victory. It simply endured, carrying the heavy cost of a verdict that protected the monarchy while leaving the family forever changed.